Good evening, everyone. It is 7 o'clock and we will be getting started very shortly. We're going to give a couple seconds for people to roll in here, so bear with us. In the meanwhile, I'll show some of our sponsors that have helped make this possible throughout last year and this year, and we are really excited to be back again in 2022.
It's nice to see the numbers rising, Lisa.
Everybody's coming in. Okay, so I think many of you know the drill. I do want to get started in the interest of making sure we get everybody back to their families on time. Welcome, good evening, and welcome to the first of the Know to Prevent virtual speaker presentations of 2022. For those of you that haven't been with us before, Know to Prevent is a collaboration of youth-focused coalitions and agencies in Westchester working together to provide parents with the tools and skills necessary to increase resilience and to reduce risky behaviors among our youth. For more information about us, for upcoming presentations, as well as recordings of previous presentations, please visit us at knowtoprevent.org. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded. All participants will receive a link to the recording, along with a handout called the tip jar. The tip jar will highlight key takeaways, information, and prompts from our speaker tonight for you to have as a reference. There will be a live Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so we encourage you to type in any questions you may have during the presentation to the Q&A box. At this time, I'd like to introduce one of our lead coalition sponsors, Alice Joslow, the coalition coordinator for Ossining Communities That Care. Alice.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm happy to be hosting this presentation related to teen mental health. Ossining Communities That Care is a community coalition whose mission is to empower, educate, and enrich our community by promoting happy, healthy lifestyles for Ossining's youth. And I'm going to now introduce Diane, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so we are in for a treat. Diane De Giacomo is a board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrist in private practice for over 20 years. And she's currently a psychiatrist working with student assistance services in Tarrytown, where she provides adolescents.
I have to stop you, Alice. That's Beverly, hun.
No, it's
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
It's Diane. Okay. She consults with student assistance services, where she provides adolescents and psychiatric evaluations and medical management. She's extensive experience working in school systems as a consultant psychiatrist in regular and special ed settings throughout Westchester and Rockland counties. So without further ado, I am so excited to introduce Diane to help us with our teens.
Hello, I am really, really delighted to be here tonight. I'm just setting up my screen for you. Okay. One sec. Yes, I am delighted to be here. And just knowing, I want to thank all of you parents who are so invested in taking the time to find something like this online to help you, and taking the time to listen, review our resources, and also the hardworking, purposeful community organizations that have contributed tonight to this, especially in the time now that we are having a youth emerging mental health crisis during the pandemic. And this presentation tonight is to go over how to differentiate teen moodiness from actual mental health disorder, which really is quite a challenge when, you know, emerging mental health disorders can come out during adolescence and late adolescence into young adulthood. So I'm going to review prevention. I'm going to let you know that I'm hopeful about this. You're here and you're caring parents and caregivers. That mitigates the risk right there for a teenager. But I'm here to share with you that mental health disorders can be preventable and treatable. And I'm going to review the developmentally normative signs of moodiness in teenagers. What are the red flags for depression and other psychiatric disorders, and how to respond constructively when you're with your teenager, as well as how to access professional help and how to access community and school supports. So,
Diane, you're
Diane,
muted.
Diane, you're on mute.
No, you're still muted.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I was minimizing all of you. Okay, moodiness in adolescence can be very normal. Teens are known for one-word answers, eye rolls, slamming doors, talking back, pouting, sullen silences. I can actually remember when my dad back in the day took my sister's door off the hinges. Your once sweet, loving, affectionate child who used to give you hugs and everything has now entered puberty. And puberty is the period during which teens reach sexual maturity and become capable of reproduction. It's hard to believe that they could go on then to reproduce their own children when we all know that, mentally, they may not be quite ready in all their decision making. Puberty occurs earlier in girls between ages 10 and 14. And usually after they've reached menstruation, they don't grow much more after that. And boys undergo physical changes between ages 12 to 16 years. So you have this very prickly on the outside teenager, but inside, I think, often they're very scared, confused. There's a lot of self-esteem changes and their body's changing. What are the hormone effects in puberty? We're all familiar with estrogen and testosterone, but one neuroactive steroid that I'd like to bring up is allopregnanolone, THP. It's a chemical that in adults and children normally helps soothe and provide a calming effect during a stressful time. However, in puberty, it becomes an antagonist, meaning it opposes and it actually increases anxiety in teens. And that's something that, would be important to reassure ourselves, to remind ourselves, maybe even discuss with a teenager, because a lot of times kids start to become anxious. I know I've gotten lots of private practice calls and phone calls and things about kids, even in middle school, usually girls, who are developing panic attacks and they don't understand why, or maybe they are about to get their menstrual period soon. And so this is something, that can help us understand the biology, the chemistry of it all. Psychological maturation is influenced by neurosteroids, which act on mood, anxiety, libido, and other behavioral functions. Puberty is a time where kids are more vulnerable and vulnerable to emotional and behavioral problems. And as I mentioned before, even to developing mental health disorders. The teen brain structure can still develop into the early 20s in young adults. And the prefrontal cortex increases connections during puberty with increases in white matter in the frontal and parietal lobes. And thus, the reasoning, judgment, and complex decision-making is not fully formed in a teenager, leaving us with impulse control issues, emotional regulation issues, risk-taking behavior. These are all actually somewhat normal in teenagers, but to what extent? And that's where we have to look at things and see, where do we draw the line on that? So teen mood swings are actually most volatile in early adolescence, and then they stabilize. I know that I've often spoken to guidance counselors, and they will tell me that there's almost like a switch that goes on in a teenager somewhere around junior year, and they start seeing a lot of maturation that they could never, ever have predicted. And, thank goodness, because that's also a time where teens are making a lot of complex decisions. They're starting to think about the rest of their life. They're going and possibly looking online or talking with parents about thoughts about their future, whether it's college, vocational training. They're thinking about what would be good for them, what they're good at. So now, why don't you grow up and act like an adult? I'm sure we've all said things or thought things or felt that way. And I know like I've said, I consult to schools, and I know that sometimes the young counselors will say to me, well, I spoke to the teen, and I tried to speak to them about their mindset. And I actually sent an email recently with a little emoji with a winky face saying, yes, if we could change their mindset, then they would all be little adults like us. So adolescence actions are guided much more by the amygdala, which is the more emotional, reactive part of the brain, and less by the frontal cortex, where there is thought and logic. So as I mentioned, they might be more impulsive. They might misread social cues or emotions. Particularly, I know that they get very defensive with adults if you just even look a certain way at them. And it's a time where there might be more chances for getting into accidents or fights. You often hear boys getting into fights with their peers at, parties and different things like that, or making kind of some silly, stupid decisions. And, you can advise them and talk to them about it, or ask them about things that you've heard. And I think that last slide I wanted to mention is from American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and they have these wonderful facts for families on their website. So you can read about a variety of these different things. So psychological adaptations. During adolescence, a teen needs to establish their own identity with their own beliefs, goals, and values. They need to separate and individuate. And so it is very normal for them to start seeking privacy, distance themselves, and even becoming more defensive. They are not as overtly affectionate. And Erik Erikson, explains to us that during adolescent ages 12 to 18 years, the main goal, the main purpose at that point in time for a teenager is to develop their sense of self. And if they don't make that conscious, separate search for identity, or they are pressured to conform to others' ideas for the future, they develop a very weak sense of self, and they may need to find themselves as adults. There are many stresses and pressures on teens during adolescence, and these include things that we may or may not have had to deal with when we were younger, including social media, bullying. I think we've all experienced that, gender and sexual orientation, substance use and abuse, family stressors. It might be a time where there are changes in the families with divorce, marital stress, economic changes. School demands and frustrations rise with the academic load that's going on, and particularly this year and the last 2 years with remote learning. Chronic illnesses in family members or parents or caregivers, death of a family member, a grandparent or aunt or uncle, moving or changing schools, and too many activities or too high expectations. I mean, we all want the kids to take whatever classes they can take for AP, IB, excel in a varsity sport, but we also have to determine what is an appropriate amount. What are the right amount of commitments? What makes somebody happy? What makes somebody able to do what they can do? And what's too much? I mean, these kids are getting up at, some of them 5:30 in the morning to get ready, look good, shower, and their day can go on for a very long time, and they're up doing schoolwork very late, they're managing jobs. Okay, so what are the risk factors for mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders in adolescence? And it's divided up into a variety of different categories. We have individual risk factors, we have family, and school and community. And being female is actually a risk factor. Women more than men have more chance of having emotional or psychiatric disorders, so early puberty as well. Difficult temperament. This might be the child who was more inflexible, who showed a very low positive mood, was withdrawn. Low self-esteem and anxiety or low-level depressive symptoms contribute to the risk of having future anxiety and depression. Insecurely attached kids, maybe those are kids who had issues in terms of maybe being adopted or other types of attachments in their families. Shyness, conduct disorder, having a favorable attitude towards drug use, rebelliousness, early substance use, head injuries or concussions, childhood exposure to toxins such as lead or mercury, and marijuana use. Family risk factors include things in the family environment, such as poor parenting, a negative family environment, including substance use, child abuse, a single parent family or divorce, parental depression, parent-child conflict, marital conflict, parents with anxiety, unemployment, or sexual abuse. And school and community risk factors have to do with things like the neighborhood in terms of violence, poverty, urban setting, low commitment to school, peer rejection, deviant peers, stressful traumatic events, or poor academics. But interestingly, I've also read on the other side, very affluent communities can be a source of pressure and very high expectations. And things like money doesn't buy happiness, and we should also consider like how much is too much stress. So there are protective factors as well, and that's what I was acknowledging when I first started the talk. And one of the protective factors is a family that provides structure, limits, rules, monitors the children, and can be predictable. There's supportive relationships within the family members, including siblings and grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, and clear expectations for behavior and values. For the individual, things like positive physical development. And what I mean by that, and it's true, like kids who are cute, kids with blue eyes, kids who are have a great smile, kids who are athletic, high self-esteem, good emotional self-regulation, good coping and problem-solving skills, and that they're connected in 2 or more spheres, such as school, their peers, athletics, employment, religion, culture. And in the neighborhood, I know that, people pick schools, pick their homes based on good school districts or a good neighborhood or a nice community. So having presence of mentors and support for development of skills and interests, opportunities in the community. You might pick a community based on community centers and sports that they have available and other activities, a good arts community. But also that there's physical and psychological safety in the community, that you can walk into town, have a slice of pizza and be safe. So what's a parent to do? It is not easy. I think the first thing is to recognize that it is common for your teen to be moody at these ages. It's very, very important for a parent to keep themselves calm in whatever way is possible. Sometimes you might start speaking softer, slower, calmer, so that they have to pay more attention and that they're not becoming defensive because you're raising your own voice. You as the adult have the cognitive and emotional skills in the more developed brain to control your responses. So, it actually really doesn't help to yell at them or to get more in their face in any way. It feels like you want to. It feels like that will stress your point and that might be the best option at the time. But usually if you're feeling that way, it's good to walk out of the room, compose yourself, come back in, maybe pick a better time for speaking, getting your own support, talking to friends who have kids this age or relatives who've gone through this or who have grown kids. Listening and acknowledging your teen's feelings goes a long way towards creating a safe environment and allowing them to feel comfortable speaking to you. Setting clear expectations and boundaries without engaging in negative emotion cycles. So negative emotion cycles would be like saying, you always, you never. It could be throwing in things from the past, which would be calling it, I know there's a psychologist, Esther Perel, who calls it kitchen sinking it. You know, oh, but what about that time that you didn't show up and you missed curfew? Try to stay in the present moment when you're discussing things and expectations. Promote an open dialogue. Don't shut out or punish. So, you know, I think parents are also often surprised, like even in private practice, when I'm working with a family, what I might have recommended for a younger child, I might talk more about with teenagers, trying to negotiate and not getting too severe with them. And most importantly, don't take it personally when they're acting a certain way, and don't take it as a sign of disrespect, because as I mentioned before, moodiness, irritability is more common due to the developing brain and hormones. And it's a fine line and a fine balancing act between structure and space for your teen and for you. So it's very important that you can help your teen establish healthy sleep habits with limits on electronics and maybe turning them off at night, making time to eat properly, have breakfast before school, have snacks for school, yet giving them space and staying connected. Sometimes I say that, you know, they don't really want you. I read somebody wrote once, all my teens need me for is food and drinks or money. But the reality is, you know, sometimes you just need to be in the house. You need to be aware. You need to be listening. You need to be looking. You need to be in the kitchen. And there might be that time. And maybe it's only Tuesday at 5 o'clock that they needed you. But you have to be available and connected to them and aware too. Help create some more opportunities for positive experiences. Look for things that they might like related to sports, volunteer work, things you could even do together like that, music, art, the community. You know, it could be simple things. It could be dog walking. It could be anything that might take those little steps to get them to feel positive and build their confidence and develop skills. And I like to say that one of my longtime friends from the first day of high school, that her son somehow made the pandemic work very well for him. He is now a senior, and he was one of those kids who was not into sports. And when sports teams shut down, he, through his mom, I know her, I know she was looking for opportunities. She found different things related to his different interests. So things about coin collecting. He actually now, due to his interest, works in a coin store. She found some sailing opportunities and he learned how to sail. She found scuba diving, things that were just out there that you have to look for and open your eyes. He was able to ride bikes with kids who weren't playing sports. So there's just a lot of things that we have to open our eyes and ears and, you know, spend time looking on the internet. And I think another important point is to work with your teen to generate multiple possible solutions that they can own. So it might be having a certain meeting time during the week and saying, you know, let's write down, let's think about what we can go over. Let's not like leave it at any moment. I'm going to come to you and start talking about all of these things, but maybe you'll have like a 15-minute meeting time to go over certain things and let them come up with some ideas that they feel like they're invested in. So I really like Gottman's research. He's done a lot of research on divorce and couples, but he has also done research on parenting styles and how they deal with teens' emotions. There are 4 types of parenting styles, 3 of which are not helpful. So the best type are the ultra parents. They are the parents who are empathetic. They accept the teen's feelings, even if they're negative feelings. They provide some emotional coaching and problem solving to them. The dismissing parent tends to ignore feelings. They want the negative feelings to disappear quickly. They might disengage from the teen when they're like that, and they see their emotions as a demand on them to fix things. So, I'm going to go through each one, but try to think about what parenting style are you showing them at the time, either by your facial cues, by your body language, by what you say or do. The disapproving parent judges or criticizes a child's emotions. They emphasize acting like everybody else, or they emphasize conformity, and they believe negative emotions are a sign of weakness. The laissez-faire parents freely accept all emotions. They set no limits. They offer no behavior guidance. They believe you just let the negative emotions ride out, and they don't help problem solve. So basically, our goal is to raise emotionally intelligent children who are good at self-soothing and who understand other people and possess good social skills. It's very important that I want to emphasize that you, the parents or caregivers, that your emotional well-being is paramount. Just like I had a mentor who would say, I'm sure we've all heard it, you put on your own oxygen masks first on the airplane. The strongest protective factor in risk and resilience studies by the psychologist, Dr. Sunaya Luther, is that the primary caregiver's mental health. And that is the most important variable in every ethnic group in research. Self-care, finding a person to talk to about important topics, helping your teen to get help, even if it's not from you, involving other relatives for support, neighbors, coaches, teachers. Maybe your teen gets along better with dad, or maybe they get along better with your sister, or there's a cousin, or anyone that you're close with that can speak with you and support them. There are support groups for children and adults. And just remember that the first intervention that you try may not work. So stay flexible, calm, and hopeful. Emotional contagion is not helpful to anyone. So as I mentioned before, the mental health of teens has been exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of statistics, between March and October, there were an increase of 31% in emergency department visits for teens ages 12 to 17 with mental health emergencies. There was a more than 50% increase in suspected suicide attempts from 2019 to 2021, mostly among girls. And children also experienced deaths of primary or secondary caregivers, with children of color impacted disproportionately. There were soaring rates of depression, anxiety, trauma, and loneliness, and the pandemic had made an already bad situation worse. There are a shortage of mental health care providers, and schools don't have adequate amount of counselors. The recommended student-school counselor ratio is 250 students to one counselor, but the ratio in 2019 to 2020 was 424 students per one counselor. And I know that also sometimes schools share psychologists, so there might be one psychologist going between schools. And there's only 40% of US schools have even a dedicated nurse. The pandemic effects on teen mental health were that there was an onset of stress-related disorders with an exacerbation of pre-existing mental health disorders. So basically, stress reactivates personal or transgenerational trauma in individuals and families. Kids were confined at home when actually, according to their developmental time span, they should have been individuating and separating from parents and engaging more with their peers. and they were experiencing high rates of social isolation and loneliness. Loneliness is basically a painful emotional experience that is the discrepancy between your actual amount of social contact and your desired amount of social contact. So there are people who are alone who may not be desiring a lot of interaction. You know, people who are more introverted, they were comfortable being at home. There was no stress on them to go out to school. Some kids who have social anxiety, they actually initially did a little bit better during the pandemic, initially with remote learning. You know, there was some regression for kids as well, of course. But it's the difference between the actual amount of contact you have and the desired. Loneliness does increase the risk of depression and anxiety. And it is not just the symptoms of the loneliness, but it's the duration of loneliness that is correlated more with mental health. And I think that's why we're all at this point, 2 years into the pandemic, starting to go a little stir crazy. And we have to be very, very creative with coming up with ways to reliably and consistently interact with others. I know that I have walked more than I've ever walked in cold and bad weather and rain with one of my friends that I had known from a writing group who happens to live nearby. You know, you have to open yourself up to all kinds of possible opportunities for social contact. So the other thing is, besides structure and purpose, fun and novelty. I mean, you know, people used to look forward to certain vacations. A lot of vacations and airlines and trips were canceled. So what other ways to create fun and novelty? And your teen needs to see you also as a fun, engaging person. You know, I talk about being the good guy and the bad guy. So decreasing feelings of helplessness is important for them and for you to regain a sense of control. So I mentioned that some mental health disorders first emerge during adolescence. 14.3% of teens suffer from a mood disorder in a given year. 11% of those experience severe impairment. Females are affected more than males, with 70% more likely to have a mood disorder. Those statistics are from the National Institute of Mental Health. And the types of mental health disorders that might first emerge during adolescence are anxiety, schizophrenia, which is not that common, and that emerges in late teens to young adulthood, depression, bipolar, substance abuse, borderline personality disorder, eating disorders, and sleep disorders. Adolescent mental health, these are some statistics from the World Health Organization from October 2019. Mental health conditions make up 16% of the global burden of disability in people ages 10 to 19 years. Half of all mental health conditions start by age 14. And this is the part that really gets to me, and I'm glad that you are all here. Most are undetected and untreated. Suicide is the third leading cause of death in 15 to 19-year-olds. Depression is one of the leading causes of illness and disability in adolescence. The consequences of not addressing it, and that's the part where I mentioned it goes undetected and untreated. The consequences of not addressing depression is that you have adults with impaired physical and mental health with limits to leading a fulfilling, independent life. Adolescents ages 12 to 17 have the lowest treatment rates for mental health. You know, there's a lot of stigma around mental illness. Even families, you know, my mom and dad, what did they say when I said I wanted to be a psychiatrist? They're like, what? What? They could not believe it. I had always wanted to be a pediatrician. I did a behavioral health rotation in second year. I did my psychiatry rotation as my first rotation, and I loved it. I really felt a calling for it. And yeah, people, you know, even in the medical field, it's not even considered one of the higher specialties to go into. So there is a lot of stigma around it, and people don't seek out treatment because of this. But we need to open this up for kids so that they can feel comfortable having these conversations with us. So this results in chronic anxiety, panic, depression, bipolar depression, and complex impairment with disability and maladaptive behaviors if mental health is not treated as early as possible. Maladaptive behaviors include things like suicidal thoughts, self-injury, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, and substance misuse. Parents can also begin to knowingly or unknowingly accommodate behaviors, including things like staying home from school. There is a good evidence base that treatment for anxiety with therapy and/or medication is effective, even though it's still underdiagnosed and undertreated. More clear evidence is that anxiety, which is usually a precursor to depression, responds to treatment more effectively than depression. So what I mean by that is basically that sometimes anxiety comes before depression in a teenager, and it is actually easier to treat it with therapy and medication than it is to treat depression. The rates of improvement from treating anxiety are much higher. It's sort of like a spectrum, and if anxiety is here, you can intervene and cut it off much more easily than you can when it comes over and progresses towards depression. What are the red flags of depression or other psychiatric disorders? There are neurovegetative symptoms, which are appetite and sleep changes, withdrawal from friends and family, little interest in previously pleasurable activities, things that they enjoyed and liked doing, feelings of low mood, sadness or irritability, and tearfulness. And that's very important point to point out, that even though an adult might feel low mood and sadness, a teenager might come across as more irritable and angry. Fatigue or low energy, guilt or low self-esteem, concentration difficulties, or unusual thoughts, hallucinations, false beliefs, or paranoia, suicidal thoughts, plans, intent, self-injury, recurrent thoughts about death. Changes in your grades, failing grades all of a sudden, skipping school or skipping class, repeated threats to run away. Now, a constellation of these symptoms together with signs and symptoms present for 2 weeks or longer are red flags and important to seek evaluation. Teen depression goes beyond just normal teen moodiness. 1 in 5 adolescents, that's 20%, will suffer depression at some point in the teen years. It can destroy the essence of their personality. That literally is what I have heard from parents. And I've heard teens say, there's nothing I enjoy anymore. They may act out in an attempt to cope with their emotional pain, showing reckless behavior, violence, using alcohol or drugs to self-medicate. They may have a persistent negative mood, including irritability, anger, and agitation. There could be unexplained aches and pains, and all of a sudden you're going for a GI workup. There could be extreme sensitivity to criticism. And as I mentioned, if there are a number of symptoms altogether meeting the diagnostic criteria nearly every day for at least 2 weeks, then this is something that requires evaluation. Causes of teen depression are multifactorial, and they include things like genetics, family history, environmental causes, social causes, bullying, loneliness, as I mentioned earlier, other mental or physical health conditions. So you can have eating disorders and depression, you can have learning disability, ADHD and depression. You could have other physical health disabilities or chronic autoimmune illnesses. There can be trauma, lack of social supports, sexual identity or gender identity issues, alcohol or drugs, family problems, and academic struggles. I really want you to understand that if there are any warning signs of suicide, that you should act immediately. And that could include things like seeking an immediate evaluation, going to the emergency room, calling mobile crisis number, contacting your pediatrician, and I'll go through some of those things. But the warning signs include things like anything about your child, your teen, talking or joking about suicide, saying they're better off dead, indicating in a hopeless way that they have no other opportunity, options, or way out. They wish to disappear. They want to go to sleep. You see them writing stories, posting songs, poems about death or suicide, referencing them, getting into accidents or reckless behavior, giving away their things, writing notes or saying goodbye to friends or family, looking online for ways to kill themselves. These are very serious. So how do you differentiate between a typical teen or a mood disorder? There's the intensity of the mood. Is it appropriate to the trigger, or is there possibly no trigger? Triggers are normative experiences, but the reactions for a mood disorder are excessive and disproportionate to the trigger. How long does the moodiness last? Does it resolve in an hour, or does it last several days to weeks? You know, it's normal for somebody to get upset about something and then move on. It's normal to have some sadness or irritability, but if it's long lasting, if the intensity is there, is the teen acting out during the mood swings? Are they engaging with others, particularly friends? Have they lost interest in their hobbies or activities? So the characteristics that you're looking at are the intensity, the impact of the moodiness or depression, the frequency, and the duration of the symptoms. So how do you go about accessing mental health care? And unfortunately, I am sad to say this is a job in and of itself, especially now during the pandemic. It had always been hard to find mental health care, but there are many more waiting lists now during the pandemic. The good news is that in Westchester County and in New York City and in areas where we live, that we have a better chance of accessing that. If you were to say Mississippi, you might not even find a child psychiatrist. You might only find a few in the state. Those kind of states have been doing telehealth for a long time. We actually have a glut of psychiatrists, even child psychiatrists. We have a lot of resources, and we're very lucky to have that. So find a mental health professional with advanced training. And on top of that, somebody who is used to working with children and adolescents. So when you call or you ask for providers on your health insurance, you want somebody, for instance, a psychiatrist who's board certified in working with children and adolescents. You're looking for a comprehensive evaluation, and then you're making phone calls to look for a good fit, a comfortable match. You're reading reviews, you're speaking to people about the people on the list. Once you obtain a list of providers or clinics in your local area from your health insurance company that participate in your network, you might take that list and ask the pediatrician or the school counselor if they're familiar with anyone on the list. Does the pediatrician's office do any collaborative work with psychiatrists or social workers? Some pediatricians during the pandemic are starting kids with some therapy in the office if they have a social worker available, and they might actually even start medication if there's a crisis, if they need to. Those are possibilities. What are other resources for finding a provider? I do feel, unfortunately, that you have to get creative right now. So what are some creative solutions? There's EAP, employee assistance programs, local medical or psychiatric societies are good places to call, local mental health associations, the MHA, NAMI, other national organizations, national professional organizations such as the APA or the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists, the county mental health department. Westchester has a lot of local hospitals and medical centers and psychiatric hospitals. And then there's, in New York City, we have centers of medical excellence with departments of psychiatry. We have NYU Bellevue, Mount Sinai, Columbia, New York Presbyterian. We are very lucky in the area we live. family resource centers, and centers for independent living. Just keep on plugging away at this, because you will find a caring person who's going to point you in the right direction. So when do you seek immediate or emergency help? I had mentioned some of the times, and particularly if you're hearing anything about suicide or violence. And what are the options? There's the mobile crisis team. I think that information will be sent to you by email. I think it's in the tips jar. There's 911. There's the emergency room at your local hospital or psychiatric hospital. There's the National Suicide Prevention Helpline, talk or text, and those numbers will be included. There's a crisis text line for those of you who might not be able to use a phone. If you feel like the person will get very upset, you can text, and a trained crisis counselor will respond in minutes to de-escalate the situation and connect you to local help. So there are different levels of psychiatric care. The least restrictive would be perhaps an outpatient therapist or a social worker or a psychologist. Then there's psychiatrists who can prescribe medication. There's intensive outpatient programs, which would be a couple days a week for a few hours a week. There's day treatment or partial hospital programs, which could be every day of the week instead of a school day. There are inpatient programs for somebody who is a risk for suicide or violence. There are case management services, residential. There's children's single point of access. This could be a system for children who already have a psychiatric diagnosis or serious emotional disturbances who need more support to remain in their homes or in the community with case management and other kinds of support for the family. I want to say it often takes many attempts to find the right treatment, and there might be waiting lists during this time, but don't give up hope. There are a lot of opportunities out there, and I think you definitely will find somebody who can point you in the right direction. We in Westchester have a number of inpatient and outpatient treatments available. I've listed them. I'm not sure if it's a fully inclusive list, but I listed what I could off of the top of my head. And I can tell you for sure, for inpatient, we have Four Winds in Katona, New York. We have New York Presbyterian, St. Vincent's, Silver Hill in Connecticut, Westchester Medical Center. I don't endorse any of these. This is just a list of what is available. There's day treatment programs at St. Vincent's and Four Winds for teenagers. And here's a list of outpatient OMH licensed clinics. There's Andrus. There's Family Service. And maybe more. So when do you talk to your teen about their mental health? I believe that you should be open and honest. If something doesn't seem right, even if you're not sure why, you should speak. You should ask. Their behavior seems different than their peers seems. Your teen is having difficulties at home, school, or with friends. Your teen is displaying signs and symptoms that I discussed in previous slides. How do we talk to teens about their symptoms? I think you have to pick a good time, a private time when their siblings are not around or other people that they would feel uncomfortable speaking in front of. A time when the conversation might flow naturally when you're engaged in an activity together, sometimes side by side, not necessarily having straight on eye contact so that they can, feel less defensive, maybe during chores, maybe when you're cooking, hanging out, car ride. If your teen is busy or having a bad day, you might want to come back to this at another time. You want to bring it up in a non-judgmental way and share your observations. There is a parent and youth screening at mhascreening.org that you could look online at. You could share your results with your teen. You can print out some information from online about, to educate them about mental illness. You can share your personal experiences for yourself or for friends that you know or family, to explain and destigmatize mental illness and that people can get help. It is very important that you keep the tone of your conversation hopeful and remind them that these are common disorders, preventable and treatable. What if your child approaches you and you're not expecting it and they come to you? You should listen more than you speak. You should ask them what they think might help them get better. You should keep their concerns confidential if they would like that, unless they're life-threatening. You should explain to them that these issues are common. You should be an advocate for helping them find the right type of treatment. You could ask them if they would like to speak to somebody at school. There are student assistance counselors at school, the pediatrician, etc. Don't minimize any of their concerns. Try to keep your tone calm and not overly emotional or judgmental. Don't lecture. Just try to understand their concerns. And don't blame other people, whether it's other people in the family, genetics, family history. Don't compare them to their siblings or make excuses. I understand that we're talking about moody teenagers who are resistant to everything, picking up their clothes off the floor to put in their laundry basket. So here you are thinking, how are you going to talk to them about getting help? So like I said, try to get them to own part of the solution. Ask them what they need to get better. Ask them if they've had anyone they know who've gotten treatment. Share information you know. If there are serious signs and symptoms, you need to get immediate or emergency help. Acknowledge that they are suffering. I think that's really a key component here. And that you will help them find an appropriate treatment provider and plan. And you have to monitor, as I had said before, your own emotional reactions to the conversation. I know that you will inside be feeling torn up. You'll feel fear and anxiety. You'll feel some sadness and disappointment because it hurts to see your children suffer. And you need to reassure them that they didn't let you down. And you can share those feelings with another adult. You don't have to share it with your teenager. You might be surprised. You might be thinking, wow, not my kid. I didn't expect my kid to have this problem. I didn't see it. But just remember, mental health issues are common and symptoms do start young. Take your child seriously. And please don't focus on guilt. Just stay in the present, look forward. Don't focus on anything in the past and move forward because you can't change the past. I want you all to remember that there is definitely hope, and your children are young, growing kids who are resilient. There are causes of mental illness that are preventable. Just by being here tonight or reading these resources, you have the opportunity of early identification and diagnosis, and it can help stave off worse symptoms and disability. Mental illness can be treated in a variety of ways, including what I mentioned before, interpersonal therapy with therapists, psychologists, social workers, group therapy. There are things like dialectical behavior therapy, which addresses how to handle emotional regulation. It could deal with how to handle self-harm. There could be treatment or coaching around executive functioning. There is cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety and depression, which deals with ways in which your teen could take control over certain behaviors and coping skills. And then for more severe presentations for anxiety and depression, one could consider medication management plus or minus therapy. And then family therapy and parent counseling and education are a very important part of all this. And keeping that relationship with your teen, engaging in things. You know, music is a great equalizer. Sharing your interest in that, even if you can't stand your teen's music, being there for them, letting them know that they have a parent or an close caregiver who is invested in them. That is the most important thing right there that will mitigate any risk. Thank you. I really enjoyed sharing this information with you tonight. I want to let you know that the next few slides, and I think you will have access to the PowerPoint on the website, has resources and references. So particular ones that I love on here: positive parenting strategies for the teen years, your teenager just moody or something more. There is resources to start the conversation with your child about mental health. There are the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. There's SAMHSA's National Helpline. We have the Crisis Text Line, Partnership for Drug-Free Kids. And then there's references to more professional articles. And that's it. I've really enjoyed sharing all this information with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. De Giacomo, for sharing your insight. That was amazing. I know there was a lot of information, but the slide deck will be available to everybody that has registered, and it will also be posted on our website. So before we dive into the Q&A, we would appreciate everybody sharing your feedback. If you just point your camera on the phone to the QR code that you see on your screen, it will take you to a link and that will pop up for you to provide feedback. It's very, very short. We will provide this slide again at the end of the Q&A session if you prefer to fill it out then. And you will also get the link if you prefer to do it once you've had a chance to kind of digest the information. It'll come in the email along with the tip jar. The survey is very, very short, I promise, but it provides us a lot of important feedback in terms of programming for future webinars. So we appreciate your time and feedback in advance. So Alice, I think we're ready to start the Q&A. I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. De Giacomo. You really presented so much very important information. Are we going to have Beverly and Dr. De Giacomo come back on the screen here? Okay.
Oh.
So I want to introduce, we've already heard and introduced Dr. De Giacomo, but I also want to introduce Beverly Pierce, who is the Director of Mental Health Services at Student Assistance Services. She holds 2 master's degrees, one in psychology and the other in clinical social work. And she's a credentialed alcohol and substance abuse counselor and a credentialed prevention professional. Beverly has extensive experience in a variety of treatment settings, parent trainings, and professional staff development in mental health and substance use related topics. And first of all, I just want to thank you, Dr. De Giacomo. I actually really wish that I had access to your presentation when I was the parent of a teenager. So it was really great information. And so many of the questions that we got ahead of time, you addressed in your talk. And really it's like teenagers are these prickly individuals who lash out at their parents more than anybody, but that as a parent, it's a good sign that they do that because it means they feel most comfortable with you. But maybe you could just, without the PowerPoint, just sort of review some of, how do you know? You talked about it. Do you have a spidey sense as a parent? If it's in your gut that there's something a little wrong, there's usually something a little wrong, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. That definitely, you want to talk with them and say, what's going on? What's going on with your friends? What are you guys doing? You might say you seem a little off the last couple of days. Something doesn't feel right. There's nothing wrong with that. You know them better than anyone. I think it's the same thing, just like with pediatricians will say to moms that they know their child better. When your little boy has glassy eyes that they're not feeling right. And there's other things, emotionally and mentally about them as well.
Moodiness, teen moodiness. What's normal and what's problematic. That's the real issue for all parents of teenagers, is how do we balance that? And one of the alarming statistics you presented to us was that adolescents have the lowest treatment rate. You
Yes,
said it was
younger adolescents. Yes, that's really
4%. And some of the questions that have already been put in the Q&A are related to, well, if you miss it when they're a teen, and then suddenly they're young adults and you're dealing with it. So, you know,
I believe it's never too late. I just think that what we can do is destigmatize mental illness and become more aware and access these opportunities earlier before they're off at school and college and things like that.
and Beverly, you play such a role in terms of working with the student assistance counselors that are in so many of the schools. And could you maybe speak to the parents about what that role is and how that's a really great place for you to start if you feel something's just a little off?
Sure, sure. The student assistance counselors are in many of the secondary schools in Westchester, and they're available for students to just walk in and talk to them. They are all master's level social workers, mental health counselors, and students really can just walk in and talk to them about any of the problems that they're having. So generally we do substance use prevention and early intervention, but are trained in a wide range of mental health issues as well. And certainly those counselors can triage, can make the right referrals, can do an assessment to determine what might be the difficulty, and then connect that teen to some resources, the teen and the parent.
Thanks.
Connect you to some resources.
Thanks, Beverly. And even if a school doesn't have a student assistance counselor, there are social workers and guidance
Absolutely.
counselors in every building.
And
they're able to do
psychologists.
that,
Absolutely.
and psychologists. So there's always a large clinical staff, but people are sometimes often reluctant to reach out, right? But early intervention is the most important thing to do. And something that I'd like both you and Dr. DiGiacomo to address is prevention and self-medication when emerging mental health issues are arising, and the role of prevention, because sometimes when students start experimenting with alcohol and drugs, that's often co-occurring disorders and self-medication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think early intervention is really key. We know that the data tells us that the earlier you intervene with these types of problems, the better success you're going to have. Often thinking it will go away is a mistake. And so one of the slides that Dr. De Giacomo had early on, really spoke to addressing these issues. I think it was being the ultra parent, being concerned, not sticking your head in the sand, but really addressing these things, having clear expectations, all of that. Those are really important in prevention.
And Dr.
I think the other thing about that in terms of using substances, I mean, kids do try things and they might feel less anxious or more calm or more chill. But the problem is they use marijuana and then they might actually from marijuana become more irritable, or they might become more angry or agitated. Or when they're not using or they're withdrawing from it, they might become that way. And I've actually also seen teens who become aggressive from that. And there are teens who might have a more vulnerable genetic or family history for mood disorders or even psychotic disorders, bipolar disorder, who might actually become paranoid, particularly with edibles. And they're at risk. And I think it's very important. I remember having a conversation with my nephew and my son on a long car ride. So they were trapped in the car and saying, listen, hey, we have a family history on both sides. And even to my nephew, I know your grandmother and my grandmother had bipolar disorder. You guys are at risk. You're at risk for using substances.
Thank you for sharing that. And a lot of questions that we got in advance were, how do you seek help? Where do you go? And often what happens is when you're in a crisis situation, it's very difficult to get the help. And that's certainly when we would advise people to call the crisis response team or to go to Westchester County Medical Center, where they have crisis teams on call. But, could you explain the process of calling a crisis team and what they do?
Yes, I actually feel very good. I mean, I practice in Rockland County, but I have had families give me feedback about the crisis team that has been so positive. Sometimes there's been issues where they have actually just been able to diffuse a situation and somebody did not need hospitalization. They were given resources to go somewhere in the community. Sometimes they just brought down the level of emotional energy in the home on both parts. So it could be done on the phone, it could be done in person. I work for a school where many of the students are from New York City and they have special education and emotional and disability needs. And New York City has a phone number, New York City Well, for mobile crisis, and they can assess with telehealth over, during the pandemic. And it often just brings it to a bearable level. I mean, if it were very serious, they can come out to the house and they can have somebody come and meet you in the home and assess the situation and take somebody to the emergency room, but it's not always necessary. So it can be very reassuring, I think.
Thank you so much for saying that, because in fact, that is their goal.
That is, of course.
The teen in the hospital. Their
Yeah,
goal is to
that's
create
traumatic.
a solution and a plan
Yes,
of action,
yes.
right? To keep the teen in a supportive environment. But what do we say to parents when it does rise to the level that the parents clearly think that their teen needs to go to some sort of therapy, and the teen is very dismissive and resistant? How should a parent address that?
I think I would like to start with that. I think
Thank
that
you, Beverly, for doing that.
I think that one of the things that, again, Dr. De Giacomo had all of this in her slides,
She did.
giving the adolescent some power and control in the decision making. And so talking to them about what you need them to do, but also giving them some of the decision making. I'm really concerned about saying, sure. So I'm really concerned about whatever the X, Y, or Z behavior is, name it, whatever it is that you're seeing. And I need you to go and talk to someone.
Mhm.
I want you to give it a try. We're going to do it for 3-4 weeks, and then we'll revisit it and see where we are. Or we're going to go and talk to someone. Would you prefer a male or a female? Give them some of the decision making. Let them know what your bottom line is, but also give them some control.
Those are good suggestions. And Dr. De Giacomo, another thing that I think parents want to know more about is medication and the role of medication in treatment and recovery, and also the whole concept of hope with facts. Recovery is possible, but
Yes, yes.
medication, people are often very nervous when they hear the word medication.
Yes, and I came from a family and parents just like that, actually. So first of all, interestingly, the research shows for anxiety and depression in children and teens that the first step should be therapy, not medication. So that is very reassuring. You may not hear that from everybody, but I want you to know that that's what the studies show. So for mild to moderate presentations of anxiety and depressive symptoms, you can start with therapy. One would be a consideration that you would start with medication. If it's a very severe presentation, if there's suicidal thoughts, if therapy has not been working, or there's only a partial response to therapy. If there is not quality cognitive behavioral therapy available, which is one of the ones that is shown to really be effective in anxiety and depression, or if there are a number of comorbid disorders like anxiety, depression, a double depression, an eating disorder, or OCD, just more severe presentations. So I do think it's a process of working with families. And unless it's a very severe presentation, often we can start with talking about an evaluation and then therapy, whether it's with myself or with a therapist or somebody else in a clinic, and then revisiting and checking in within 4 weeks, 6 weeks, depending, to see how therapy has made any progress or not.
And sometimes, like you alluded to this, the match of the therapist is so critical. And how can you, as a parent, ensure that if the teen, when they started working, that it's actually a good match, right? Because the teen might say, "Oh, I don't like them."
Yeah.
Is it that they're being resistant, or is it that the therapist isn't a good match?
And sometimes it's not. You're right. I mean, and that's why sometimes it's just like, you're looking for your hotel that you're going on vacation. You're going to read reviews. You might ask other people, have you ever stayed there? Or did you ever, use this person? So you're going to call and you're going to ask some questions, and you're going to see what the person's style is like over the phone. How interactive are they with you? Are they willing to answer questions? Are they short and abrupt, or do they want to engage in a conversation? Do they laugh with you on the phone? Do they joke around a little bit? Because humor is very important with teens.
And let's talk about therapy. A lot of therapy now is teletherapy,
Yes.
telehealth, right? And how does that compare with in person? And are teens receptive to that?
Actually, a lot of them are very receptive. And I remember when March 2020, and I pivoted to telehealth, and I actually had a teen in the clinic who's like, I've been doing this for a while. I'll show you what to do. But she had been doing it with somebody in the city for therapy, and I was the psychiatrist. But kids FaceTime, kids play video games. They're used to this. But all of a sudden you have a window into what their room looks like. You might see things on the wall that give you clues into their interests or their hobbies, or they're more comfortable in their own space rather than in a formal clinic, in a waiting room where they had to wait for other people. They had to drive there. It's not taking so much time out of their day. They might be less irritable about that if it's a half hour or 50 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I know at the agency where I work, telehealth with regard to behavioral health has increased the number of people coming to appointments.
They can't get away. You call them on FaceTime or send the link, and
Well,
yeah.
they're not
As well as
committed.
follow through and consistency.
Right, absolutely. Could both of you sort of discuss the impact of the pandemic on mental health and what
Hmm.
you've been seeing with teens in
Hmm.
the past year and 3/4?
Yeah, I would say certainly a lot of anxiety, um, loneliness, um, some isolation, um, fear, even fear. Um,
Teens
and,
need
and a
we
lot of, and a lot of these are already prevalent in adolescence. So certainly just continuing to see that fear of, when I say fear, I mean fear of parents getting sick, fear of bringing the virus home. Um, those are the kinds of fears that I'm speaking of.
and so many people talk about how especially for teenagers, the way they socialize has been impacted
Mm.
so badly. I mean, teens like to watch scary movies on a couch that fits 3 people and have 17 on it. Like teens need to be with their friends. They need to have that contact, and it's been very difficult and has had a huge impact.
Sure, sure. Socialization is a key developmental factor in adolescence, and it has been impacted greatly through the pandemic, and that has been very difficult.
Dr. DiGiacomo, could you must, because you do consult with so many schools, you know, are there some overarching observations that you've heard from so many schools that you work with?
Well, I mean, there's the disappointments for teenagers as well about losing certain cherished milestones,
Oh, yeah.
graduations, proms. They're angry about that. And or they just feel like there was no acknowledgement of something they had worked so hard towards. Like I just remember when my daughter was a high school senior, everything was about her, and the dress and showing the dress online. And she wasn't even a dressy kind of girl. But just, certain things like maybe trips that they would have gone on, things like that. I think there's, a huge loss of a loss there for them, things that they counted on in their world of being there and getting through those milestones and kind of taken away in
And how
this.
do we reassure them as parents? Because, sometimes we as parents are like, are like, oh, what's a big deal? What's a big deal? But these are important milestones for
Mhm,
teens,
mhm.
right?
They
They're
are.
very important.
They are. And I think schools have done a really great job of being creative and trying to acknowledge, some of these milestones. They've done really, innovative things.
Yeah, people have really turned around and whether it's finding silver linings or being more inventive. I even had somebody tell me that they did a virtual Secret Santa when Omicron came out, and they dropped presents off at different doors, and then they all opened it together online together. I mean, I was pretty impressed by that because I think we were all very disappointed by this year's holidays and fearful ourselves as adults. I mean, we were all getting together, and who was exposed, who did we have to disinvite that day, or who was homesick. It was a scary time this Christmas and New Year's.
Let me ask you, we've talked about getting the teens into therapy. Could you also talk about the importance of family therapy when you're working with a teen?
Well, I think for any disorder, the fact that even though a lot of therapists will say, well, this is the teen space and this is their therapy, the parent has to have an opportunity to share their concerns so that the therapist is aware of it and that the teen is aware of what those concerns are. So there's the parent piece in terms of whether it's counseling or providing education, but then there's the family piece after a therapist has worked long enough with a teen and has gotten them to a point where they can speak with the family in a way that's productive and helpful. And in order for a disorder to be addressed, it's not just within the individual, it's within the environment that they live in and all the support that they can get. And I think I mentioned in one of the slides that sometimes we start accommodating each other. I know somebody was telling me that their wife had OCD, and he would accommodate her rituals to leave the house. And parents do that as well. So that could be something that could be addressed, and maybe the teen isn't even thinking about that. But there are ways in which parents and family make things easier for kids. And that's great. We want to make things easier, but we don't want to make it too easy when it's part of the disorder.
Let me ask you a question. You talked about how one of the things that should increase a parent's spidey sense is when responses from teens are disproportionate to what you were asking or dealing with. So, can you provide some examples of what responses that are disproportionate to the trigger might look like?
So let's see, maybe their show isn't on TV and they're throwing things and yelling and it goes on for a long time.
Mhm.
usually you think you can kind of get over that. It could be little things. They didn't get something in the mail that they were expecting. That makes us all disappointed, but taken to the level of a higher intensity or a more frequent or a longer duration. So if it would be something you might be upset about for half hour or an hour, but it lasts all day or into the next day or so, then that's concerning.
And many parents are asking that we say that there are all these resources in the school for kids to go to, but sometimes the kids may be reluctant to do that. And how can we make the teens themselves recognize that they should connect their peers to help if their peers are reluctant to seek it?
Yeah.
I feel like teens do that. Don't you, Beverly?
Yeah, I do. I do. I can tell you that in our program, the number one referral source are self-referrals, and number two are referral by peer. So I
Okay.
think that is already happening quite a bit.
Mhm.
I mean, you don't want to make it the responsibility of another kid, but certainly friends refer friends and they are concerned. And I think they do hear that in their health classes. They hear that in some of their classes about how to reach out and how to help someone.
Mhm. Um, someone was asking about, we're focusing on teens and adolescents. What about the younger population? And you had talked about, both of you had talked about anxiety, and Dr. Giacomo, you talked about how anxiety usually comes first before depression, and anxiety very much manifests itself in the younger elementary grades, 3, 4.
Or, I mean, you have separation anxiety, you could have phobias. I mean, before a child, panic attacks don't even usually happen till teenagerhood, but there are things that show up earlier than that. And that was part of what I was speaking about, undetected, undiagnosed. Sometimes anxiety could be around for 7 or 8 years before it even comes to the forefront for evaluation. So you could be 7 years old and you could have a stomach ache in the mornings, and you could have problems going back to school after a vacation. And you might not really get to a treatment provider till you're 14 or 15 when you're having panic attacks and social anxiety, because there's sort of a different spectrum of how that comes out with the different ages.
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting question. Someone said, do you think the pandemic has stolen young teens' sense of invincibility? And what type of effect is that having on their happiness? It's an interesting question, right? Because teens are programmed to be invincible because their frontal cortex is not yet developed. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that they don't have that ability to put brakes on yet.
Yeah, they're accelerating. They're just going. And I know I was reading something today about sleep in teens, and there's an area, the putamen, that's involved in that as well. And that tends to be more risk-taking behaviors. So yes, I think that, yeah, I mean, I've had kids say that they, what you were saying earlier, they worry about people around them. They worry about hurting or infecting other people. They're concerned for their own parents' safety. There's so much that they've had to worry about. There's the economic changes for people. I know jobs, some jobs weren't even happening at the start of the pandemic. There are a lot of things for kids to worry about during this time.
And while all of that is true, from my experience, I would say they still feel as though they are quite invincible.
Okay. We have an interesting question in terms of foods and vitamins and supplements, and even one related to CBD. So could you both address that for us in terms of supplements and
Yeah,
stuff?
I don't, I'm not, I'm not that knowledgeable about all of that. I would definitely say that good, consistent, healthy nutrition is important in terms of vitamins, vitamin deficiencies, all of that. You know, many kids don't eat breakfast or lunch and come home and haven't eaten any till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And, you know, not eating adds to moodiness, it exacerbates that, adds to concentration difficulties. You know, I know that there are a lot of parents out there giving CBD gummies. I don't know the research on that. Very often I have not necessarily seen anything significant about its effects. I have not actually I haven't necessarily seen negative, but I haven't seen positive either.
So we only have time. Thank you. We only have time for a few more questions. Sleep, the importance of sleep. We haven't discussed that. Could you talk about that with teens?
Sleep is so restorative, physical, mental. Even myself, I'll think to myself, oh, something seems like a big issue at night, one night. And when you wake up in the morning, it's just, it's minimized in its own way. It's put into perspective. And, you know, kids, they're not very tired until after 11, 12 o'clock at night. That's just the way the biology works in teenagers. They're more on a delayed sleep phase cycle. And we have to help them with structure and everything, opportunities for exercise activity to help them fight against their bodies wanting to stay up later, because then they don't get enough sleep. They're getting up at the crack of dawn, and they have a long day, as I mentioned. There are sleep disorder centers, and I've been bringing this up more and more. Well, first of all, before we even get to a sleep disorder center, there are things online about sleep hygiene. There's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. There are sleep disorder centers at Columbia University, has 2 or 3 different locations. It's very, very important to address sleep, because impaired sleep can lead to moodiness, and then it can lead to depression and other mental health disorders. So very important.
Thank you. Beverly, anxiety. We've heard the words anxiety so much today. How are your counselors seeing anxiety manifest itself in the schools?
Yeah. I think a lot, again, Dr. De Giacomo brought this up in her presentation, but there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, particularly when coming back to in-person school initially after being a remote learner for so long. That was very difficult for a lot of adolescents, and just feeling as if they are on top of things, the amount of work they have. So you have a lot of that anxiety, and adolescents deal with it in very different ways. Some go into overdrive, some start using drugs and alcohol, some just back away and drop everything and they don't want to do anything. So it depends on the teen, but it's been a number of ways that it's been presented.
And one last question, Dr. De Giacomo. We haven't actually spoken much about social media and, you know, this whole like image and perfection that teens have to put forward and how that impacts anxiety and depression. Maybe you could speak
Yeah,
about that.
I mean, definitely there's kids who see themselves missing out on opportunities, that their friends are getting together without them. I mean, that didn't always happen before we had things where people were posting what they were doing. There's kids who are comparing themselves to their peers in terms of their looks, their achievements, their athletic abilities from seeing things posted on social media. There's even adults who are saying things like that on Facebook and Instagram, and it's concerning. It's a lot for them to live up to in terms of this idea of a certain image or perfection.
And in closing, maybe you could just, we spoke about at the beginning, 1 in 5 people are struggling with mental health, typically, are the statistics. And I would say during the pandemic, it's 5 in 5. But maybe you could just remind us about the hopefulness of treatment and recovery and destigmatizing it, because health is physical and it's mental. You need both of them.
Yeah.
Health is health, and they're both important.
Oh, yes. I mean, I love how at colleges they call it student health center, because you can go there, you can meet with a therapist. You, just like Beverly said, you can go into the student assistance counselor and talk. Their doors are always open. It's important to vent, to have another perspective, to hear things, to know that there's opportunities for more help out there, and to know, like Beverly was saying, maybe your team will only need to speak to somebody for 3 or 4 weeks. Maybe it's one of those adjustment disorders. Maybe it's going to be something where they're going to need therapy for the whole year. Maybe it's that they're going to need therapy, some medication, and then in a year or two, they'll be going off medicine. Maybe they'll stay on medicine, but they will continue to succeed and flourish and, exceed your expectations and their expectations. There's so many outcomes, but you can't get to all those good outcomes without seeking some kind of intervention, and early intervention is the best.
So thank you so much. This was such an important topic, and we're so grateful that you could join us and that you're willing to share all of your slides. And Lisa, I'll let you close it out.
Sure. I am going to share my screen super quickly. Just, can everybody see my screen? Yes. Just to give people an opportunity to provide your feedback. Again, please point your phone to the QR code that you see, and it'll take a brief minute just to fill out. And then the other thing I did want to mention was that the next webinar will be on February 16th, The Dangerous Truth About Today's Marijuana, Johnny Stack's life and death story. She is a phenomenal speaker with a wealth of knowledge. She hails from Colorado and shares a very detailed and poignant story about her son, Johnny Stack, and a wealth of information in terms of what we need to be aware of in terms of marijuana, especially in the landscape of legalized marijuana in New York State. So please join us for that. You can register by going to the QR code. So we want to thank you again, Dr. De Giacomo and Beverly, for your insight tonight, and to everyone out there for joining us and taking the time to learn a little bit more about how we can support the mental health of our young people. Be sure to visit our website to check out the next presentation, register, and access recordings of prior presentations. Have a good evening, everyone.